Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well. Baldur's Gate 3 is a game that I think many of us would describe as impossibly dense in the best way. You can spend hundreds of hours in this world and still stumble across small details you've never noticed before. Even beyond the major story beats, the characters and the choices, there's a huge amount of care baked into the quieter corners of the game, with references and nods that are very easy to miss. Some of these are tributes to the older Baldur's Gate games, some to other video games, while others pull from even film and literature. So today I wanted to go through 20 Easter eggs and references in Baldur's Gate 3 that you might have missed. Just quickly, if you enjoy this type of content, please consider subbing to the channel and dropping a like, and without further ado, let's get right into it. Okay, starting off the list, one of my favorite little details in Baldur's Gate 3 is surprisingly something a lot of people never notice. The Astral Prism, which is of course the artifact that drives so much of the game's story, is actually shaped like a D20. Now once you notice it, it's pretty much impossible to unsee. So yeah, the prism isn't just some angular crystal, but it's a near perfect 20-sided die, which as you all know is the most iconic symbol in Dungeons and Dragons. And I'm pretty sure this was a pretty intentional choice by Larian. In many ways, the artifact is an object tied to fate and chances that constantly hang in the balance, which is basically what a D20 represents in tabletop play. In a way, I think this perfectly captures what Baldur's Gate 3 is built on, where every major decision you make is ultimately shaped by invisible roles happening behind the scenes. I actually brought this up in a prior video, but I just had to bring it up again. In the lower city, you can meet a merchant named Geezer Loris, who's understandably upset because his cabbage stand has been destroyed yet again. And if that sounds at all familiar to you, it's because this is a very clear nod to the recurring cabbage merchant gang from Avatar: The Last Airbender. Just like in the actual show, this poor merchant seems to be permanently cursed from suffering damage to his cabbage store, no matter where he decides to set up shop. But to me, what really sells this reference though is that Loris even has unique dialogue if you're playing as a monk, which of course directly leans into Aang's own monastic roots. It's a small and playful nod, but in a world with mind flayers and giant brains, it's good to know that in the middle of it all, someone's biggest enemy is their cabbage store. One of the more instantly recognizable Easter eggs in Baldur's Gate 3 shows up in the form of the necromancy of Thay. Visually, to me, it's pretty hard to miss what this book is referencing. The stretched and screaming face that's pressed into the book's cover is a near perfect match for the Necronomicon Ex Mortis from the Evil Dead franchise. It's a design that I think many horror fans would recognize immediately. And what I personally like about this reference is that the similarities don't just stop at the visuals. Much like the Necronomicon, the Necromancy of Thay is a book that is dangerous and tempting. It promises you power, but this can come at a real cost. Honestly, turning such an iconic horror prop into an actual in-game artifact feels perfectly on brand for the world of Faerun, which treats forbidden knowledge as something that can genuinely be unsettling. This one's a great little modern reference that shows up as a gold tied to the charlatan background, titled "Not to Worry, I Have a Permit." Now if that phrasing rings a bell at all, it's because it's a direct reference to the sitcom Parks and Recreation, when Ron Swanson hands over a permit that simply reads, "I can do what I want." To be honest, this joke works perfectly in this context, because charlatans are all about bending the rules and confidently bluffing authority. It's again just a small reference that doesn't really affect the tone of the game at all, but it's a nice little reference nonetheless. As you all know, Baldur's Gate 3 is full of systems that are built around persuasion, deception, and confidence, so slipping a joke like this into a background goal feels just right. Gale is a character who seems like he's constantly performing, and one of the nicest little details you can easily miss reinforcing that is how often he quotes Shakespeare. During combat, Gale will often remark, "What fools these mortals be," which is almost directly lifted from Puck's line in A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is, "Lord, what fools these mortals be." And again, like many of the smaller Easter eggs on this list, this perfectly fits the character of Gale. As I think we're all aware of by now, Gale is often theatrical, and so slipping in some Shakespeare into his dialogue feels completely natural for the way he speaks. To me, it also reinforces the idea that Gale sees the world almost as a stage, where powerful beings toy with mortal lives for reasons way beyond their understanding. Again, to me, this line greatly complements Gale's personality, and it's definitely one of my favorite little details in this entire video. If you've ever played some older RPGs, namely the Fable series, this next reference should definitely sound familiar to you. Now just to give some context, in the original Fable game, the hero starts out with the incredibly unflattering title of Chicken Chaser, which is a nickname that you carry around until you begin to show a little bit of your worth. Now Baldur's Gate 3 actually pays homage to this exact joke with its own version of the same title, which you can earn by winning a special minigame that's in the Goblin Camp, which I'm sure a lot of you have done before. What I personally really like about this reference is just how casually it's handled. It's simply there for players who remember some older RPG titles that in many ways paved the way for games like Baldur's Gate 3 in the first place. It's a small nod, but it carries that same old school RPG humor that emanates from the Fable series. This one is an Easter egg that I only discovered while doing research for this video, and man, is it an absolutely great one. Scattered throughout Baldur's Gate 3, you can actually find portraits that depict companions from Divinity Original Sin 2, quietly hanging around like pieces of forgotten history. Characters like Losei, Ifan, and the others aren't just highlighted for you or named outright, but they're just there, existing in the background for you to accidentally stumble upon them. This one's also fantastic and one that a lot of long-time Larian fans are definitely going to appreciate, especially as it's the game that I think many would say laid the foundation for Baldur's Gate 3 in the first place. It's a small but great reminder of the studio's journey, and for players who've been following them since the Divinity series, it feels like a quiet thank you hidden in plain sight. There's actually a surprisingly modern bit of humour hidden away in Lady Janeth's estate that I'm guessing many of you didn't catch, at least the first time round. Now, to give you some context, if you hang around long enough in the kitchen area of the estate, you'll hear the chef absolutely tearing into another cook with the line, "You serve this to Lady Janeth, it's raw." If you haven't already clocked it, this is a very obvious reference to one of Gordon Ramsay's most infamous outbursts on his iconic Kitchen Nightmare series, and it lands instantly even if you've ever seen only one clip from the show. Again, I find this another perfect detail, as the game doesn't flag it or emphasize it at all. It's just a line that you may or may not hear while passing through the kitchen, delivered completely straight. If you catch it, you catch it, and if you don't, everything carries on exactly the same. If you're already a fan of the original Baldur's Gate games, I'm guessing this little nod is something that you've already caught before. Naaber is one of those characters in Baldur's Gate 3 that feels instantly annoying, but in his case, that's actually the whole point. Found wandering across Baldur's Gate and talking your ear off at any opportunity, Naaber is a direct continuation of a long-running joke from the original games. In Baldur's Gate 1, you had Naaber, in Baldur's Gate 2, there was Naaber, and later even Naaber, all characters that were defined entirely by how they refused to stop talking. Now in Baldur's Gate 3, Naaber carries that legacy forward almost beat for beat. What I think makes this version of the joke even better than the original though, is just how deep the joke goes. If you cast Speak with Dead on him, he'll reveal that he's actually related to his equally irritating predecessors, turning a simple gag NPC into a full-blown family tradition. Baldur's Gate 3 actually has quite a lot of literary references, with this particular one hidden in something as simple as a familiar. If you summon a raven using Find Familiar, you'll quickly notice that it has the unique name of Quoth, making it the only standard familiar in the game that has an actual name. That in itself is definitely a giveaway, but the reference goes even further when you realize the Raven gloves summon a raven with the same name. This is for sure a clear nod to Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven and its famous quote, "Quoth the Raven, nevermore." I know I might be sounding like a robot now, but again, what I really like about this reference is how subtle it is. And for a game that leans so heavily into often gothic imagery, especially in Act 2, I think this is a surprisingly fitting piece of literature flavor that's tucked away for anyone who happens to notice. This Easter egg is definitely one of the more on-the-nose ones in this entire video. There's a weapon you can find in the Waning Moon called the Rat Bat. It's a spiky great club, and if its name alone sounds oddly specific, it's because it's an explicit reference to a moment in the sitcom It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. In one episode of the show, Charlie proudly wields a bat that is wrapped in chains and nails, dubbed the Rat Stick, as a solution to a rat problem. Baldur's Gate 3 perfectly turns that exact joke into an actual usable weapon. The game doesn't play it up at all, but it just drops this absurdly named and looking item into the game's most grim and cursed environment, letting you find it all on your own. It's another perfect example, among many on this list, of Larian slipping small pop culture references into the world without ever breaking immersion. This one could arguably be labeled as a double reference, depending on what Larian actually intended it to reference. Basically, there's a line in the Necromancer Wizard description that I'm guessing many of you will find instantly familiar. It opens with, "As you walk through the Valley of the Shadow of Death," which many of you will immediately associate with Gangster's Paradise. Of course, that line itself is famously lifted from Psalms 23:4, which makes this reference feel layered rather than accidental. It sits right at the intersection of both scripture and pop culture, all wrapped into a single sentence. So whether you clocked it based on the lyric from Gangster's Paradise or from Psalms 23:4, the game treats it like any other subclass description text, leaving the reference completely up to you to notice. Even while writing this, I'm still a little unsure whether this is an actual reference or just a big coincidence. This is a fun little cameo that is tucked away in Sharesa's caress that I think many of us Witcher fans may recognize immediately, especially if you're paying attention. Hidden quietly at a table in the tavern is a man who looks suspiciously like Geralt of Rivia. He's got white hair, rugged features, and that sort of brooding monster hunter energy that we're all familiar with. It's never something that's acknowledged directly, and you can't even interact with the NPC, but the resemblance to me feels far too deliberate to just be a coincidence. In respect of Baldur's Gate 3, I personally find this to be a simple visual nod to The Witcher 3, which is of course another modern RPG that left a massive impact on the genre. It's simply a quiet wink to players who know exactly who they're looking at, and nothing more than that. This one is very niche, but it's one that I think many fans of animated shows might appreciate. There's an item in Baldur's Gate 3 called the Shield of Shielding, whose name is a direct nod to an episode of the iconic animated TV show Gravity Falls, titled Dungeons, Dungeons, and More Dungeons. In that episode, the character Grunkle Stan panics mid-game and hastily invents a spell called Shield of Shielding, which of course implicates something with no imagination behind it. And so just like with the Rat Bat, Larian took that exact name and turned it into a real and usable item, which is kind of perfect. Again, this is not something that I think a lot of players are going to recognize unless they've actually seen the episode, but it fits right in with the game's obvious love for tabletop games culture. One of the more obscure references in Baldur's Gate 3 is one that's hidden behind an otherwise unassuming merchant interaction in Act 3. In Rivington, near the Rigged Toys, you'll find a merchant who, if you convince to show you his exclusive stock, will have a great axe in stock with the name Sethan. Now, the name of the item and even its effects aren't random at all, but it's actually a direct reference to JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, specifically Stardust Crusaders. In that part of the story, the character Alessi wields an axe and commands a stand named Sethan, which has the power to de-age its enemies. In Baldur's Gate 3, the weapon with the same name mirrors this almost exactly. The axe lets you summon a spiritual great axe akin to a stand and applies a unique form of reduce, shrinking enemies down. Even among this list, this one is one of the most obvious references in the list, and it's nice homage to one of the most important anime series of all time. This Easter egg is less about a specific pop culture reference, but more about RPG history itself. In Act 3, you'll encounter a dwarf cook who asks you to deal with a rat problem that he has, and on the surface, it's one of the game's most mundane and simple quests. But that's actually why it works so well as an Easter egg. In the original Baldur's Gate game and many other RPGs at the time, killing rats was often one of the very first quests you'd be given on your journey. It was a genre staple at that time, as it gave developers a low-stakes way to introduce a game's combat system before the real adventure really began. Baldur's Gate 3 knowingly plays into that trope, dropping it into a game where you're constantly dealing with mind flays and world-ending threats. It's a quiet, self-aware nod to where the genre as a whole came from. If you're a fan of a particularly popular indie game, this quiet reference is something that you might have recognized almost immediately, or at least found familiar. In Baldur's Gate 3, when your character looks into a mirror, they'll remark something along the lines of "still me, despite everything." Now, that line is a near direct echo of one of the most memorable lines in all of Undertale, where the protagonist reflects, "Despite everything, it's still you." Going into it a little deeper, both of these lines actually serve a similar purpose. They ground you emotionally, cutting through everything that's happened so far and reminding you that your identity still matters, no matter how much it seems you've changed. Again, it's a subtle one without any acknowledgement, and it exists naturally within the moment, but if you do catch it, it adds an extra layer of meaning that fits right in. This one's something that I think fans of Final Fantasy XIV are definitely going to appreciate. The phrase "a smile better suits" appears as an inspiration for the folk hero background, and it's an undeniable nod to one of the most iconic lines from Final Fantasy XIV's Heaven's Ward expansion. In that story, the full line is, "Don't look at me so, a smile better suits a hero." It's become a sort of bittersweet mantra that's been repeated throughout the game's later expansions. Like some of the other references on this list, I believe this one works so perfectly because of how naturally it fits Baldur's Gate 3. Both games are once deeply concerned with heroism and the emotional weight that is carried by people expected to save the world. The quote isn't just played for nostalgia or shock value, but it offers a familiar kind of encouragement to players who know exactly where it comes from. As I mentioned earlier, there's an array of small literary nods scattered throughout Baldur's Gate 3, with one of them hidden in a couple of in-game books that I think most of us will probably skim right past. The books Lacey and the Modrons and The House on Drenched Lane and Other Stories are both credited to the Sisters Macabre, which is a clear reference to the Brothers Grimm. Now, much like the Grimms, these fictional authors are tied to unsettling fairy tales rather than the softened versions that most of us are familiar with. And honestly, that's what makes this reference feel so appropriate. Baldur's Gate 3 leans heavily into the idea that folklore and fantasy aren't always meant to be comforting or lighthearted. Instead, they're cruel and often tragic. Ultimately, this reference is just another great reminder that this world is built on the older and darker roots of fantasy storytelling that characterize writings like that of the Grimms. For the final Easter egg on this list, we've got a pretty meaningful nod to one of the most impactful MMOs in gaming history. Of course, I'm talking about the Doomhammer, which is an uncommon weapon that you can buy from a goblin vendor near where Volo is performing. And while on the surface it may seem just like another blunt weapon, the name of it is doing a lot of work. If you haven't realized it yet, this is an obvious reference to the Doomhammer from World of Warcraft, which is of course one of the most iconic weapons in MMO history. Even going into it with way too much detail like I usually do, something I like about this reference is the parallel it unintentionally draws. World of Warcraft helped pull MMORPGs into the mainstream, in the exact same way Baldur's Gate 3 has done for modern CRPGs. It's a quiet acknowledgement of another genre-defining game, slipped into Baldur's Gate 3 for avid fans of the impactful MMORPG to notice. And that is 20 Easter eggs and references hidden throughout Baldur's Gate 3 that you might have missed. Now, as it was probably obvious, none of these are massive on their own, but together they honestly show how much personality and care went into building this world. They're the kind of details that reward curiosity rather than demanding your attention, and that's something that I think most of us appreciate. Again, like always, if you've spotted any references of your own that didn't make the video, I'd love to hear them down below. Anyway, that's all from me for today's video. If you enjoyed, please consider subbing to the channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 and RPG content, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.